Welcome to Module 5, Adoption as a Permanency Plan for Dependent Children. This module is designed as an overview to increase understanding about Oregon's adoption process for children in the child welfare system. In addition, it will emphasize the importance for relatives and members of the child's team to understand how they can impact the process, support children, and be an advocate for permanency through adoption. The Department of Human Services has three primary values associated with adoption planning that are highlighted through specific policy and procedure and are responsive to federal and state mandates. The first value is the use of a collaborative decision-making process for all lifelong permanency decisions for children, including adoption. One way that collaboration happens is by involving the child's team in permanency planning and making recommendations regarding adoption, placement, selection. The child's team is a group of individuals knowledgeable about the child's needs and may include the child's caseworker, the child whenever developmentally appropriate, the child's attorney, the CASA assigned to the case, a tribal representative if the child is Native American, a member of the Refugee Child Welfare Advisory Committee if the child is a refugee, and relatives when they are knowledgeable about the child's needs. Relatives can play a critical role during the adoption process and can influence a plan for adoption in many important ways. Relatives can assist in the identification of all possible relatives who can be a resource and collaborate with the department on behalf of the child. Relatives can contribute to the creation of a life storybook, which will capture for a child their journey through the child welfare system. And relatives can provide additional medical and social information and family history, stories, and photographs. In addition to collaborative decision-making, which includes the child's team and relatives, the department values the importance of maintaining family connections. This is reflected in the department's preference for relatives as the adoptive resource and in keeping sibling groups together in adoptive placements. When there is no relative resource available to adopt, significant efforts are made to keep the child connected to the birth family. The primary way this happens is through a mediated adoption agreement. With the assistance of a mediator, an agreement is developed cooperatively by the birth and adoptive family that creates a plan for communication and contact. In all cases, a mediated adoption agreement reflects what is in the child's best interests and is legally binding. Finally, the department values and works towards timely permanency for every child. Timeliness for permanency is ultimately guided by state and federal law. In an effort to avoid children languishing in foster care, great progress has been made to move children into permanent placements if they cannot safely return home. Ultimately, the goal is to choose a family that meets the lifelong needs and best interests of each child in as timely a manner as possible. Oregon Administrative Rule requires that certain case planning decisions are made in a collaborative process called permanency committees. The Permanency Committee makes recommendations regarding permanency plans when a child or young adult is not likely to return to a parent. The Permanency Committee provides recommendations in three areas related to the adoption process. First, when a foster parent who is the current caregiver is requesting to be considered as an adoptive resource for a child, or when the caseworker is considering the separation of siblings for adoptive placement, or when a non-related person with an existing relationship to the child wishes to be considered as the adoptive resource. Members of the child's team are notified of the date, time, and location of a permanency committee and given an option to participate, make recommendations, and provide information about the child. The Child Welfare Program Manager or designee will take the recommendations of the child's team into consideration when making a final decision. It is important to note that the adoption selection decision, meaning the decision of who will adopt the child, is not made at a permanency committee. The order matter of preference for considering a potential adoptive resource for a child is clearly outlined in department policy and Oregon administrative rule. The first choice for preference in an adoption is to place with a relative. If there are no suitable relatives, the second option would be a person with an emotionally significant relationship or a current caretaker. These two options can be considered separately or together. The third option is considering a current caretaker who has been designated as such through a permanency committee and a general applicant. The final option is a general applicant with an existing relationship with the child as determined by a permanency committee or a recruited general applicant. It is important to remember that when a child is identified as Native American, the department must comply with the Indian Child Welfare Act. Additionally, when a child is identified as a refugee, the department must comply with policies specific to placement of refugee children. Oregon administrative rules governing the matching of a child's needs with a potential adoptive resource are comprehensive. For each adoptive resource that is identified, there are three key questions to be answered. First, if there are siblings, is this a family who can take a sibling group? Can the family meet foster care certification standards? And finally, can the family meet the child's needs now and in the future? In addition to these three questions, there are a number of other factors to consider when looking at whether a family can meet a child or sibling group's long-term needs. Adoption placement selection can be likened to looking at a crystal ball, as the future outcome of a particular placement decision cannot be assured. Becoming familiar with criteria to consider regarding adoptive placement selection will provide an avenue for input for child welfare practitioners, advocates, and attorneys. At times, there are multiple relatives who are asking to be considered as the adoptive resource. When this occurs, the child's caseworker will request the family members to choose the most appropriate relative to be the child or sibling group's adoptive resource. If family members cannot decide, the child's caseworker will make the decision and select up to 3 relative resources to be considered for adoptive placement. Each of these families will then have an adoption home study completed. Once the caseworker has identified 1 to 3 families who may be a potential adoptive resource, the adoption selection process goes forward. Adoption selection can be made by one of 3 ways: the caseworker in consultation with their supervisor, by a local adoption committee in conjunction with a central office adoption decision specialist, or by a central office adoption committee in conjunction with a central office adoption decision specialist. Which process will be used depends on the complexities or dynamics of a case. The first method for adoption selection is by the caseworker in consultation with their supervisor. After input from the child's team and after consultation with their supervisor, the child's caseworker can choose the adoptive resource in the following situations. First, when there is a single applicant for adoption of an Indian child and the applicant matches the placement preference required for Indian children. Second, when there is a single applicant for adoption of a refugee child and the applicant matches the placement required for refugee children. Third, when there is a single relative applicant identified for a child or sibling group. Fourth, when a child's current caretaker is the only adoptive applicant. And finally, when a child under 6 years of age has no extraordinary needs and is being considered for adoption by a general applicant only. A second method for the adoption selection decision is by a local branch adoption committee in conjunction with an adoption decision specialist. This method of adoption selection occurs when the selection is for a single child who is age 6 or older, or the child has extraordinary needs, or it is a sibling group being placed together and the potential adoptive resource is a general applicant, or finally, when a child's current foster parent is being considered as a general applicant along with other general applicants for the child. A third method for adoption selection is by a central office adoption committee in conjunction with an adoption decision specialist. Situations that require this adoption selection process include the following. when more than one relative is requesting to be the adoptive resource, or when a relative and a child's current caretaker are requesting to be the adoptive resource. This method is also used when a current caretaker is being considered along with a general applicant, or when the potential adoptive resources include more than one current caretaker being considered for siblings who will be placed together in adoption, or when a DHS staff member is a potential adoptive resource, and finally, when the potential adoptive resource is an individual living outside of the United States. Individuals who are invited to an adoption committee should inform the child's caseworker if they plan to attend. Approximately 10 business days prior to the committee, they will receive notice of the committee and written materials such as adoption home studies, which should be thoroughly reviewed. On the day of the committee, those in attendance should inform the adoption committee facilitator of any plan to participate as a committee member. Individuals participating as adoption committee members will be asked to provide their recommendations regarding the selection of an adoption resource. The adoption decision specialist is responsible for selecting an adoptive resource after consultation with members of the adoption committee. After the adoption decision specialist makes a decision regarding the adoptive resource, the child's caseworker is notified and provides notification of the decision to members of the adoption committee. Once notified, the adoption committee has 7 calendar days to request a review of the decision if they disagree with it. The final review is conducted by the department's adoption manager or designee. Adoption is the social, emotional, and legal process in which children become full and permanent members of another family. In most cases, children who are adopted will maintain a psychological connection to their birth family. Selecting an adoptive resource for a child is a process with significant emotional and legal impact for everyone involved. Adoption has many facets and touches people in different ways, depending on their role and perspective. Relatives, along with child welfare practitioners and other advocates, play an important part in collaborative decision-making regarding adoption placement selection. They should be given ample opportunities for meaningful participation on behalf of a child throughout the adoption process.